Bill Gates spent the first 20 years of his career fighting a war against free software. He wrote the letter that started it, he built the company that profited from ending it, and for a decade, his own chief executive stood on stage and called the operating system that would eventually challenge Windows a cancer. So here's a question nobody in the tech press has bothered to ask him directly. Why does the philanthropic foundation carrying his name spend millions of dollars funding, building, and running on open source software? The exact philosophy he once tried to kill in its crib? This isn't a story about hypocrisy for the sake of a headline. It's stranger than that, and more interesting. It's a story about what happens when the man who built his fortune on keeping software locked down has to solve problems that locked down software simply cannot solve. It's a story about payment systems for people who don't have bank accounts, health records for villages that don't have reliable power, and a foundation quietly becoming one of the most significant funders of open source infrastructure on the planet, while almost nobody connects it back to the name on the building. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the world's most famous critic of free software ended up bankrolling some of it. To understand why this is such a strange turn, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to Windows, not even to MS-DOS. Back to 1976, when Microsoft was a handful of people above a furniture store and Bill Gates was a 20-year-old college dropout trying to keep his company alive. Microsoft's only real product at the time was Altair Basic, a programming language Gates and Paul Allen had written for the Altair 8800. One of the first personal computers ever sold to hobbyists. The problem was that the hobbyist community of the mid-1970s didn't think of software as something you bought. Punch cards, tapes, and code listings were routinely copied and passed around computer clubs the way mixtapes would later circulate among teenagers. Software was seen as something closer to an idea than a product. You couldn't hold it, so why should you pay for it the way you paid for hardware? Gates disagreed violently. He believed his company had spent thousands of hours of skilled labor building that basic interpreter, and that hobbyists copying it for free were stealing food out of his employees' mouths. So he did something almost unheard of for a 20-year-old running an 8-person company. He published an open letter, mailed and printed in hobbyist newsletters across the country, essentially accusing the entire hobbyist computing community of theft. The letter argued that most hobbyists must know they're using stolen software, that this discourages good programmers from writing quality tools, and that it threatens the survival of small companies like his own trying to fund real software development. It was blunt, it was confrontational, and it landed like a grenade in a community that saw itself as an idealistic, collaborative movement building the future of computing for the good of everyone, not for a paycheck. The backlash was immediate and furious. Gates was mocked in newsletters, accused of greed, and treated as an outsider who didn't understand the culture he was trying to profit from. But here's the thing. Gates won. Not the argument in the newsletters, but the war that mattered. Over the next 2 decades, the model he defended in that letter became the entire foundation of the software industry. You paid for a license. You didn't get the source code. You definitely weren't allowed to copy it and hand it to your neighbor. Microsoft built an empire on that principle, and Bill Gates became the richest man in the world enforcing it. That 1976 letter wasn't just a piece of hobbyist drama. It was the founding document of proprietary software as a business model. And it set Gates and Microsoft on a direct collision course with a very different idea that was quietly forming on the other side of the world. Free and open source software. Fast forward 2 decades. By the late 1990s, Microsoft wasn't a scrappy startup defending its survival anymore. It was the single most dominant software company on Earth, controlling the operating system on the vast majority of the planet's personal computers. And a new threat had emerged that Gates's old letter couldn't have predicted. An operating system built by volunteers, distributed for free, with source code anyone could read, modify, and redistribute. It was called Linux, and it terrified Microsoft's leadership more than any competitor they'd faced before. Why? Because Linux wasn't a company you could outmarket, outspend, or acquire. It was a licensing philosophy called copyleft, baked into what's called the GNU General Public License, that guaranteed the software and anything built on top of it would remain free and open forever. You couldn't buy your way out of that. You couldn't outlitigate a community. Microsoft's response, especially under Gates' successor as CEO Steve Ballmer, became one of the most infamous chapters in the company's history. Ballmer publicly compared the open source licensing model to a disease that attaches itself to anything it touches, and internal Microsoft strategy documents from that era, later leaked to the public, laid out coordinated campaigns to slow Linux's momentum, funding studies questioning its security, lobbying governments against adopting it, and warning enterprise customers about vague legal risks tied to using open source code. It's important to say clearly, this wasn't paranoia from a company that felt threatened for no reason. Linux genuinely was an existential question for Microsoft's entire business model. If operating systems could be free, why would anyone pay Microsoft's licensing fees? For a company whose founder had built his entire reputation defending the idea that software should be paid for, an operating system built on the opposite principle wasn't just a competitor, it was a rebuke. And Bill Gates himself wasn't a passive bystander during this era, even after he'd handed day-to-day CEO duties to Ballmer. In interviews throughout the late 1990s, Gates dismissed Linux as a niche product for hobbyists and server administrators, insisting it posed no serious threat to Windows on the desktop. He was, at the time, mostly right. Linux never did meaningfully dislodge Windows from ordinary consumers' desktops. But the dismissiveness in his public comments reflected the same instinct from that 1976 letter. Software built and given away for free wasn't a real business, and it certainly wasn't something worth Microsoft's genuine respect. This is the Bill Gates that existed in the public imagination for most of 2 decades. The man who called hobbyists thieves, the company whose executive called free software a cancer, the billionaire who dismissed Linux as irrelevant. If you told anyone in the year 2000 that this same man's philanthropic foundation would, within 2 decades, become a significant funder of open source, Linux-based software specifically because proprietary alternatives couldn't solve the problems he cared about, they would have laughed you out of the room. But that's exactly what happened. In 2000, Bill and Melinda Gates combined several smaller charitable efforts into a single organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Over the following years, especially after Gates stepped back from Microsoft's daily operations in 2008 to focus more on philanthropy, the foundation grew into the largest private charitable foundation in the world, with an endowment eventually exceeding $50 billion. Its stated mission was enormous in scope: reduce extreme poverty, improve global health, expand access to education, and, critically for this story, extend digital and financial services to billions of people the traditional banking and technology industries had simply never bothered to reach. That last goal is where everything starts to change. Because when you're trying to build financial infrastructure for people in rural Kenya, Bangladesh, or Nigeria, people without bank accounts, often without reliable electricity, frequently using basic mobile phones rather than smartphones, the proprietary, licensed, closed-source software model that built Microsoft's fortune runs into a wall almost immediately. Think about what proprietary software actually requires to function at scale. Licensing fees, paid per seat or per server, that stack up fast across an entire country's banking infrastructure. Vendor lock-in, where a government or bank becomes permanently dependent on a single company's roadmap, pricing, and goodwill. Closed source code, meaning outside auditors, security researchers, and local engineers can't verify what the software is actually doing or adapt it to local needs like different currencies, languages, or regulatory requirements. For a company selling productivity software to wealthy enterprises in North America and Europe, none of that is necessarily a deal breaker. But for a foundation trying to bring a Kenyan mobile money system and a Nigerian bank into the same interoperable payment network, without either country's financial sovereignty being controlled by a foreign software vendor's licensing terms, those constraints aren't inconveniences. They're the entire problem. A licensing bill that scales with every new bank, every new mobile provider, and every new government agency that wants to plug into the system isn't just expensive. It actively works against the entire point of building infrastructure meant to include as many people as possible, as cheaply as possible, for as long as possible. So the Gates Foundation quietly began funding a different kind of infrastructure entirely. In October 2017, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation released something that, on its face, sounds almost unthinkable given everything you've just heard. A piece of open source software, source code fully public, free, for any bank, government, or company on Earth to use, modify, and build on top of. It was called Mojaloop, drawing from the Swahili word moja, meaning one. Built in partnership with fintech developers including Ripple, Dwola, Modusbox, Crosslake Technologies, and Software Group, Mojaloop was designed to let any mobile money provider, bank, or merchant in a country connect to a single interoperable payment switch, meaning a customer of one mobile money service could send funds directly to a customer of a completely different provider without either company having to build a custom integration or charge punishing fees for the privilege. The Foundation's own leadership was explicit about why this had to be open source rather than a licensed proprietary product. Costa Peric, who led the Foundation's Financial Services for the Poor initiative, described the goal as giving the payments industry a solution flexible enough to serve any provider in any market, without locking any single country into a single vendor's technology. That's not a minor technical detail. It's a direct rejection of the business model that made Microsoft, and by extension Bill Gates himself, one of the wealthiest entities in human history, Mojaloop runs on infrastructure built around open source components, deployed on Linux-based servers, the same category of technology Balmer once compared to a disease, not because engineers at the Gates Foundation have some ideological attachment to Linux specifically, but because deploying financial infrastructure across dozens of developing economies on Windows Server licenses at Windows Server prices, with Windows Server's dependency on a single American corporation's continued goodwill, would have undermined the entire mission before it started. If your goal is to reach the 1.7 billion people worldwide, who at the time still lacked access to basic digital financial services, the very last thing you want is a licensing model that adds friction and cost to every single new user brought onto the network. By 2020, Mojaloop had grown enough and mattered enough to global financial inclusion efforts that its backers decided it needed permanent neutral governance rather than remaining a foundation-funded side project. So the Mojaloop Foundation was formally launched as an independent nonprofit with sponsor members, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation itself, alongside Google, the Rockefeller Foundation, PhonePe, Ripple, and others. As of recent counts, more than 400 developers around the world have contributed to the project. That's worth sitting with for a second. The organization carrying Bill Gates' name is a founding sponsor of a nonprofit built specifically to maintain free, open, publicly auditable financial software. The polar opposite, in almost every meaningful way, of the licensing model that built his personal fortune. If Mojaloop were an isolated experiment, you could reasonably chalk it up to one unusual project team making a pragmatic call. But it isn't isolated. The Gates Foundation's relationship with open source infrastructure, specifically infrastructure built under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation, the nonprofit organization that stewards the Linux kernel itself, along with hundreds of other open source projects, has continued to deepen for years. In early 2024, the Linux Foundation launched a project called Tazama, an open source real-time fraud detection platform designed for national payment switches, the same kind of critical financial infrastructure Mojaloop supports. Tazama was launched with direct support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and hosted operationally by LF Charities, an arm of the Linux Foundation itself. The Foundation's deputy director for payment systems went on record describing the platform as a way to address fraud, detection and compliance challenges while helping build more inclusive financial systems, particularly in lower income countries. Read that sentence again. A senior official at the Bill Gates Foundation is publicly praising a project literally hosted and operated by the Linux Foundation. The organization, named after the operating system Gates' own company once tried to strangle in its infancy. This isn't a one-off headline either. Foundation staff have appeared repeatedly at Linux Foundation events focused specifically on open source adoption in the financial sector, discussing how to overcome industry resistance to open source tools and accelerate their adoption across banking and fintech. Organizations like Bankserve Africa, the West African Central Bank Consortium BCEO, and national payment infrastructure providers across multiple continents have been evaluating and adopting these Linux Foundation-hosted, Gates Foundation-backed tools as core national infrastructure. Think about the layers of irony stacked on top of each other here. The Linux Foundation, an organization whose namesake operating system Microsoft's leadership publicly compared to a disease less than 3 decades ago, is now hosting and operating critical financial infrastructure for entire countries, funded in significant part by the foundation of the man who built Microsoft. And it's happening quietly, in press releases and conference keynotes that never make it anywhere near the mainstream tech press, let alone anywhere close to the kind of Gates versus Linux narrative that dominated the operating system wars of the 1990s and 2000s. It's also worth noting that this pattern isn't limited to payments and fraud detection. Across the broader world of global health and development, the same logic keeps showing up again and again. Health information systems used to track vaccinations, disease outbreaks, and clinic supply chains across dozens of low-income countries increasingly run on open-source platforms rather than proprietary enterprise software. For exactly the same reasons, Mojaloop went open source. Cost, local control, and the ability for a country's own technical staff to inspect, adapt, and maintain the system without being permanently dependent on a single foreign vendor. The Gates Foundation has funded pieces of that ecosystem too, quietly, for years, without much of it ever showing up in a headline about Bill Gates personally. So why did this happen? Why would an organization founded by the single most consequential defender of proprietary software in computing history end up funding the opposite philosophy again and again for over a decade? And the honest answer isn't ideology, it's math, and its mission. Start with cost. Licensing proprietary enterprise software across national financial infrastructure, health record systems, and government services in dozens of low and middle-income countries would be staggeringly expensive at the scale the Gates Foundation operates. Every dollar spent on licensing fees to a software vendor is a dollar not spent on vaccines, malaria nets, or agricultural development. The actual outcomes the foundation is judged on. Open source software strips that cost out almost entirely. You pay for the engineers who deploy and maintain it, not for permission to use it in the first place. Then there's sovereignty, which matters enormously in the specific countries where the foundation concentrates its work. A government building national payment infrastructure or a public health data system doesn't want to be permanently dependent on a foreign company's pricing decisions, discontinuation choices, or willingness to keep supporting older versions of a product. Open source software, hosted on servers the country itself controls, running on an operating system nobody can revoke a license for, gives that government genuine long-term control over critical infrastructure. That's not a small technical preference. For nations that have historically had very little leverage over the multinational technology companies dictating terms to them, it's close to a matter of principle. It's the difference between building your country's financial backbone on land you own outright. Building it on land, you're perpetually renting from someone thousands of miles away who can raise the rent or evict you whenever they choose. And then there's transparency, which matters just as much in health and finance as it does in cybersecurity. Source code that anyone can audit means independent security researchers, local university researchers, and government technical staff can actually verify what a fraud detection system or a national payment switch is doing under the hood rather than trusting a vendor's word for it. In sectors where a hidden bug or backdoor could mean millions of people's financial data or medical records are exposed, that transparency isn't a nice to have. It's foundational to trust. And trust in systems meant to bring previously unbanked and undocumented people into formal financial and health systems for the first time, is arguably the single most important currency involved. None of this required the Gates Foundation or Bill Gates personally to suddenly develop a philosophical conversion to the free software movement he spent the 1990s dismissing. It simply required the foundation's engineers and program officers to look honestly at what would actually work at the scale and in the contexts they were operating in, and conclude, repeatedly, project after project, that the open source model Microsoft once treated as an existential threat was frequently the only model that made sense. Here's what makes this story genuinely strange, rather than just an interesting footnote about software licensing. Almost nobody has ever asked Bill Gates about it directly. Search through years of interviews, profiles, and public appearances, and you'll find Gates discussing malaria eradication, global vaccination campaigns, nuclear energy, and artificial intelligence at enormous length. You will not find a single major interview where a journalist sits him down and asks the obvious question. How do you reconcile funding Linux Foundation infrastructure and open source financial platforms with a career spent building your fortune on the opposite model, and with your own company's leadership once comparing that model to a disease? It's not that the information is hidden. The press releases exist. The Linux Foundation's own announcements name the Gates Foundation directly. The Mojaloop Foundation lists the Gates Foundation as a founding sponsor on its own website. This isn't buried in confidential documents. It's sitting in plain sight in publicly available nonprofit filings and tech industry trade press, waiting for someone with a microphone in front of Gates to connect two very public dots. Why hasn't it happened? Probably a combination of things. Tech journalists covering Gates today are largely focused on his current, more headline-friendly interests. Climate technology, pandemic preparedness, artificial intelligence. Financial inclusion infrastructure in the developing world, however consequential, doesn't generate the same clicks as a soundbite about AI replacing jobs. And the open source community itself, which might otherwise be the group most likely to notice and highlight, this irony has largely just quietly welcomed the funding and moved on, without spending much energy revisiting old grudges from the Ballmer era. There's also a simpler explanation worth considering. Maybe it isn't actually much of a contradiction at all once you separate the man from the company he built decades ago, Bill Gates. The 20-year-old founder needed proprietary licensing to keep his 8-person company alive in 1976. Bill Gates, the head of a $50 billion philanthropic foundation in the 21st century, needs whatever tool actually solves the problem in front of him. And increasingly, for the specific problems his foundation has chosen to tackle, that tool has turned out to be open source, hosted, in more cases than you'd expect, by the very organization that carries Linux's name. That doesn't erase the irony. If anything, it deepens it. This isn't a man being forced into open source against his will by circumstance. It's a man whose organization has voluntarily, repeatedly, and publicly chosen to fund, sponsor, and rely on the software philosophy he spent his most powerful years arguing against. Because when the stakes shifted from market share to actual human outcomes, the free software model kept winning the practical argument, even for him. There's a version of this story that ends with a clean, satisfying moral. The villain grows up, learns his lesson, and quietly makes amends. That's tempting, but it's probably too neat. Gates has never publicly disavowed the proprietary software model that built his fortune, and Microsoft itself, under current leadership, has spent the last several years embracing open source tools far more aggressively than it ever did under Gates or Ballmer, shipping its own Linux distribution for internal use, acquiring GitHub, and building a Linux subsystem directly into Windows. So, in some sense, the man and the company he founded have been moving in the same direction at roughly the same time, for roughly the same practical reasons, without either of them ever really stopping to explain why to the public in plain language. What's left, once you strip away the temptation to turn this into a redemption arc, is something more interesting than a moral lesson. It's a case study in how thoroughly the economics of software changed underneath an entire industry over the course of 50 years. In 1976, proprietary licensing was the only model anyone in Gates' position could imagine funding real software development. By the 2020s, for the specific mission of reaching billions of the world's poorest and least connected people, open source had quietly become the more rational choice. Not because the ideology won the argument, but because the underlying economics of global development simply demanded it. Back in 1976, a 20-year-old Bill Gates wrote a furious letter accusing an entire community of hobbyists of stealing the value out of software that should have been paid for. It set off a fight over what software even was, a product to be owned and licensed, or an idea to be shared and improved collectively, that would define his entire career, and in a lot of ways, define the modern technology industry itself. Nearly 50 years later, the organization that carries his name is quietly funding and relying on the very philosophy he once fought so hard against, not out of ideology, but because it's the only approach that actually works at the scale of the problems he's now trying to solve. Somewhere between a furniture store above a computer shop in 1975 and a $50 billion global health and finance operation today, the argument that made Bill Gates a billionaire and the argument that Bill Gates' foundation now quietly funds ended up on opposite sides of the same table. Nobody's forced him to answer for it because almost nobody's ever asked. Maybe that's the most interesting part of this whole story. Not that the contradiction exists, but that it's been sitting in plain sight in press releases and nonprofit sponsor lists for years, and it took this deep a dive to even put the two timelines side by side. If you found this as strange and fascinating as I did, make sure you're subscribed, because we cover stories exactly like this every week. The hidden history behind the biggest names and companies in tech that nobody bothers to connect the dots on. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think this counts as hypocrisy or just 50 years of a very smart person following whatever actually works? I'll see you in the next one.